For the session of sublime ideas, which it was, then this is not only the mundane, but the crud, because that's what psychologists study. We study the crud of human thought and human feeling. It does not require that diabolical plots be hatched to accomplish great evil. It is a homely, ordinary thing. So said a wise person, echoing not only Arendt, who you heard a lot about this morning, but encapsulating the past 50 years of experiments on the nature of evil doing. For those of us who did stop to use the word evil since 2002, when George Bush used it in the phrase axis of evil, it seemed prudent to distance ourselves from that kind of jingoism, and I certainly was part of it. But having been chastised by Susan Neiman and being welcomed by Bob Mnookin and Homi Bhabha and the other organizers of this conference on Confronting Evil, I just want to thank them for bringing us back to attend the important set of issues the concept of evil raises in all the ways we absolutely should give it our attention. In this segment, we have an exciting group of 3 mind scientists who identify as decision scientists, as neuroscientists, and perhaps above all as psychologists. The focus is not just on demonstrating that ordinary people can and do engage in the horrific acts we name evil, but a lot more is known now about the conditions underlying when and how and even why it emerges. The 3 individuals you're going to hear from have each made important contributions to topics such as the lack of conscious awareness and what's been termed bounded ethicality, the relationship between rationalization and evil, of collective processes rather than just individual ones, and the underlying brain mechanisms that give us a glimpse that we do not have a single moral core. Whenever psychologists see aspects of human behavior that produce in us strong intuitions of goodness as an essential property of the person who has performed extraordinary acts of altruism, and likewise, when we feel a strong intuition about the presence of evil as an essential property of the person when we see extraordinary acts of harm, we psychologists have pulled back from both of them. And so I think Homi was right to ask about the banality of good, because I see it as only the counter side to the other. And we ask the question if indeed things seem the way as they look to us. The early experimental work, starting with Stanley Milgram over 50 years ago, was characterized by descriptions of the simplest building blocks of evil, with careful sidestepping of any normative analysis. After these 5 decades, we are better able to say something about the conditions of brain and mind, of social and political structures like religion and governments, of genes, about culture, and the all-powerful immediate situation that explain the emergence and the abatement of evil. And with it, I think, a slightly more normative thread is emerging as well in this work. I'm going to introduce each speaker by saying something about them for 1 minute, to place some flesh on the very modest biographies they've provided of themselves. Max Bazerman, our first speaker, is Strauss Professor at the Harvard Business School and already now Director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government. Max has studied decision-making and negotiation for decades and taught about it both within the business schools that he has been at, as well as to governmental agencies and for-profit organizations in over 30 countries. He has written books on decision-making, on negotiating, and on ethics, most recently Blind Spots with Anne Ten Brunsell, published by Princeton University Press in 2011. His influential work has focused on topics such as accounting fraud, on want versus should conflicts, on the barriers to making wise trade-offs, and environmental decision-making. Max's work suggests that costly ethics training of the sort that most corporations offer these days are likely to fail, in fact, surely will fail, he will say, because they rest on the faulty assumption that individuals can and do recognize ethical dilemmas when presented to them. On the contrary, and based on so many social and cognitive biases that are now well documented, Max expands the debate on ethics by showing that poor decisions are often unintentional and not even in one's own organization's self-interest. He has demonstrated this also with case studies of real events like the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster, steroid use in Major League Baseball, the financial market crashes of recent years, and the energy crisis. So please welcome Max Bazerman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mazarine. Let's pull up. It's just a real honor to be on this phenomenal panel. These are all my co-authors. Lee was one of my intellectual heroes in the literature when I was a graduate student. Mazarine is the most important scholar in my new journey to focus on bounded ethicality, which I'll define in the next slide. And Josh Green is my colleague who's most likely to say smart things that lead me to say wow on a regular basis. So, but anyhow, what I want to do is talk about the fact that we so rarely notice and confront evil, and talk a little bit about why. There is a disclosure up here that all these organizations which I'll be talking about, I've been involved with in some way at some time. So if that might bias what I have to say, so you'll have to discount as you see fit. Banerjee and Bhaskar in 2000 first used the words bounded ethicality together to talk about something that many philosophers would say is not about ethics, because they were talking about something that does not include conscious deliberation. And in a paper with Dolly Chugh, who is a doctoral student that Mazarine and I both worked with, who's now a professor at NYU, we wrote together that bounded ethicality refers to the systematic and predictable ways in which humans act unethically beyond their own awareness. Or why do good people engage in bad behavior? And this has really been the focus of what I've been studying for the last dozen years. And there are a variety of things that we do wrong without even noticing that we're doing wrong. Certainly the most famous of this kind of work is the work of Mazarine and Tony Greenwald and their colleagues on the ways in which we're sexist and racist and ageist, etc., without necessarily knowing that we're doing anything wrong. But we also favor our in-group without realizing how we're harming the in-group, discount the future, overclaim credit, disengage from moral issues that would keep us from buying the blue jeans that we want to buy, I think, which is connected to the comment from the scholar from the Netherlands. And we don't notice the environmental triggers that lead us to unethical behavior, such as we're much more likely to cheat to avoid a loss than to obtain a gain, which I think is a particularly important empirical observation in the recent environment. But my talk today is going to focus not on how people engage in bad behaviors without knowing that they're doing anything wrong, but how we don't notice the unethical behaviors of others. Many of you will recognize this slide. I'm not going to stop and show this video because the majority of you have either seen this or the gorilla video before. And in short form, the way this works, this is Ulrich Neisser's version, which I first learned from Mazarine in 2003, but Neisser created this in the 1970s to show that if you're busy counting the number of basketball passes between the players in the white t-shirts, what's remarkable is you don't notice a clearly visible woman with an umbrella who walks across the screen in front of the players. It was only in 2003 that I first saw this video attending a lecture by Mazarine where I had spent my life being proud of my ability to focus. And like many of you, I correctly counted the passes as 11. And it's fair to say that my obsession for the last decade has been the fact that I didn't notice a woman with the umbrella. So this talk is really a continuation of my obsession with that topic. So I'm not going to show you the video because of time. But what I want to do is highlight sort of why we don't notice. Okay? And here's some of the reasons that I think that we know. In the basketball video, what's clear is a significant part of the reason we don't notice is that we're busy. We're counting passes. Okay. In 2005, early March of 2005, I was hired by the Department of Justice in the largest civil litigation in the history of the world. It was DOJ against the tobacco industry. And I quickly became among the least favorite witnesses of the tobacco industry. I was warned not to engage in inappropriate behaviors because I was probably being followed. And this occurred at a time when I was busier than I had ever been in my life. And I'll skip the details behind that. And I was scheduled to be, and Mazrin was a subcontractor to my work to advise me on implicit psychology. And I was scheduled to testify in court on May 4th, 2005. And by April 30th, I had spent 166 hours working on this case in March and April alone, squeezing that into what was already a busy schedule. And I arrived in Washington, D.C. early on the morning of April 30th to prepare with the DOJ's attorneys. I had already submitted my direct testimony in writing. And when I arrived at the DOJ, a very nice young man who was the main attorney working on my testimony, recent Harvard Law School grad, very smart guy, who, when he first hired me, it took him about a week to stop calling me Professor Baserman and use my preferred name of Max. But he had adjusted. And on April 30th, he sat down and he said, "Professor Baserman, the Department of Justice requests that you amend your testimony to note that would not apply if any of the following 4 conditions existed." He proceeded to read to me legalese that I didn't begin to understand. And I said to this nice young man, "Why would I possibly say yes to that, given that you know I didn't even understand what you just said, and that if I did understand what you just said, I'd probably say no?" And he said to me, "Because if you say no, there's a good chance that my superiors will eliminate you from the case and you won't appear in court on May 4th. After I had quite significantly disturbed my life over the last 2 months. I said, "Okay, I say no." And he said, "Good, then let's prepare in case you're still in the trial." I did appear in the trial. I remember being stunned by these events, but not knowing quite what to do. The trial ended in early June. On June 17th, I woke up in a hotel in London at 5 a.m. I opened up my notebook computer to the front page of the New York Times, and a guy named Matt Myers, hero of the anti-tobacco movement, had come forward with testimony. He had also been an expert witness in this case, that the Department of Justice, led by the number 2 official at the Department of Justice, Robert McCullum, had engaged in trying to manipulate and destroy his testimony. And as I read this, I said, wait, this is my story. But what I also became aware of was Matt Myers had come forward and said, these people are doing bad things. And it was 6.5 weeks, and I hadn't done so. I quickly called Marla. I'm married to Marla, and she knew more about Washington than I did at the time. And I said, I think I'm supposed to be a whistleblower, but I really don't know how one does this. Can you find that out for me? And when I returned from a busy day in London, at 5 p.m., 12 hours later, I called Marla, noon back in Boston, and Marla said, a guy named Louis Clark is the president of the Government Accountability Project. They represent whistleblowers. He's your attorney. He's waiting for your call. After you talk to him, the reporter from the Washington Post will be covering your story. And all those things occurred, and I came forward with my testimony. And overall, I received good press for being a business school professor who accused the tobacco industry and the Bush administration of trying to corrupt the largest civil litigation in the history of the world. And for me, one of the fascinating questions is, how did I ever go so long without basically doing something? I knew something was wrong. I could have spent the effort, but why didn't I? Well, I didn't know what to do, and I was busy. And I think a lot of us end up not sort of doing the right thing, largely because we're busy. If we were asked to puzzle what's the right thing to do, we'd get it right, but we get it wrong. Okay, so we're busy. We're also often motivated to not take action. In terms of the people who might be motivated, we could think of people at Penn State, the Catholic Church. We could think about the feeder funds to Madoff. And in the earlier session, we heard about Colin Powell. And across these stories, loyalty can play an awful big role in keeping us from speaking out. I think that loyalty in many ways is one of the most overrated virtues, in the sense that loyalty is often a culprit in keeping us from speaking out. Outcome bias, we tend to not blame people or do anything until the bad outcome occurs. But evil is a process. And by the time the bad outcome occurs, it's often too late. We don't notice evil when it occurs on a slippery slope. Okay? My image of Enron is not that they were a good company who fell off the cliff one day, but that their bad behavior occurred slowly over time. Motivated by Josh Green's excellent work in Trolleyland, which I trust we'll hear probably something about, we worked together on a project on indirect blindness. The punchline here is we tend to not notice when people do their dirty work through others. So if you get someone else to do your dirty work for you, we tend to not notice. And the focus of the rest of my talk is we don't notice when others don't want us to notice. And there are a lot of people who are particularly good at keeping us from not noticing. Magicians, I think, are the best in the world. But con artists are good. Advertisers are good. Politicians don't want us to notice when they don't answer the question that we asked, or what my colleagues Todd Rogers and Mike Norton call dodging. Negotiators don't want us to notice when they basically change the topic rather than answer our questions. And there's industries that profit from us not noticing, and I'll get to a surprise guest perhaps at the end of my talk if my time allows. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of 3 industries. So I'm really going off at number 6, industries that don't want us to notice, and I want to talk about 3 of them. And I'm gonna short circuit 1 and 3 because my guess is that they don't need any convincing. And number 2, you probably have never thought much about. So I want to convince you that evil isn't just guns, which Professor Neiman talked about earlier, but it applies to lots of other industries as well. So I want to quickly tell you, I'm going to basically assert that tobacco has been shockingly good at perpetuating evil and keeping us from taking action in society. I'm also going to argue that the climate deniers have been remarkably good at keeping us from taking action that would create net benefit over net costs. Okay? So I'm going to skip that and tell you a little bit about auditing, which I assume you know less about. And then what I want to do is talk about the commonality of these 3 industries. And my guess is that we could substitute guns if I was somewhat better informed. Okay, so auditing. So why does auditing exist? This is a topic that half of the room has never even thought about. Because most people think auditing sounds like a really boring thing. The quick notion is auditing exists in the United States and most developed economies so that corporations have to have their financial books assessed for reasonableness by an external or independent third party. The quick observation I want you to note is that if they aren't independent and objective, they have no reason to exist. Okay? That their only purpose is independence. And then the next thing I want to note is because of threats to auditor independence that exist in the actual institution, that they are not independent. And why aren't they independent? Because auditors get rehired by their clients. Okay? Auditors sell consulting services to their clients, and the people actually doing the work on the audit, if they leave their audit firm and take a job elsewhere, the most common place they go is that they take a job with one of their clients. So I would argue to expect objectivity from an audit firm is about as reasonable as to trust the parents in the room to give us an objective assessment of how smart is your eldest child. Okay? It's not that you're bad people that you wouldn't be very good at that task. Okay? But because of the normal psychology of how we see people attached to us, we're incapable of doing so. In 1997, this is 16 years ago, my colleagues Kimberly Morgan and George Loewenstein and I wrote a paper called The Impossibility of Auditor Independence. This is back in the days where you used to get those little postcards requesting reprints. So some of you are old enough to remember those. It's fair to say that we had no requests for reprints. But the reason was auditing is boring. Okay, so that was easy for me to come up with an external justification. But I had no evidence that anybody had read this until 2000. When the SEC was holding hearings on the question of should auditors be allowed to provide consulting services, and I was called to appear before the SEC. We provided these arguments, and it's fair to say that the big five auditing firms that were left at the time, including Arthur Andersen, did a shockingly thorough job of both testifying and lobbying to keep the SEC from taking the most obvious actions. They didn't. Enron collapsed. In 2002, we kind of had a terrible piece of legislation called Sarbanes-Oxley that didn't attack the fundamental problems, and bad events continue to occur. And the AICPA is again trying to make weak and insufficient changes. Overall, I would say that the auditing industry is being very, very successful in keeping change from occurring. What's interesting is you have a question up here. What makes more sense? In order to maintain auditor independence, auditors are prohibited from establishing long-term cooperative partnerships with their clients, from providing non-audit services to their clients, and from taking jobs with their clients. Or alternatively, we could start by creating a variety of incentives that lead auditors to want to please their clients and then try to identify a complex set of legislative and professional incentives to counteract the corrupting influences created by the desire to please the clients. Which makes more sense? Well, as a society, we've gone for number two, okay, which I would argue makes little sense. And again, we could talk about climate, and we can talk about tobacco. And what Ann Tenbrunson and I do in Chapter 7 of our book, Blind Spots, is that we identify what are the common tactics used by the industries that want to prevent change. Okay, we could question details of the methods of the critics. We could falsely imply that the details undermine the basic claims. We could falsely accuse the critics of being politically motivated. We could suggest that there's doubts in the research community long after the science is clear. Focus on and exaggerate the costs of corrective action. Justify the transparency in what you do and what you know for as long as you can get away with it. Obfuscate. Here's some examples that we see across the three industries. Then we got change the argument slightly, so when you can no longer maintain sort of the what you said earlier, you basically adapt and pretend like you never made the other claim. Tobacco is certainly best. Tobacco literally went from the 1920s, where cigarettes are good for you, to the 40s and 50s, no causal connection exists. To cigarettes may be one of many factors that create illness. There is no evidence of secondhand smoke affecting health. And I'm missing some dots there. And most recently, in order to defend their behavior in court, they basically say you can't really hold us culpable. After all, smokers knew the risk all along. Okay, so basically we see an evolving shift in what the arguments are, and this pattern exists kind of across industries. I'll jump to the bottom one because calling for more research that's really popular with academics, and I just want to highlight that that the question isn't do we need more research. The question is do we need more research before we have enough knowledge to take action. And somehow the ability to claim that we need more research seems to be a very, very effective tool, again, created by the tobacco industry and mastered by these other industries. How many minutes do I have?
Another 5.
Another 5. Okay. Then I want to talk about... What's... Okay, I'll aim for 3. All right. So I want to talk about another industry, and that's the social scientists in the room. A lot of you are familiar with the Mark Hauser story on this side of the Atlantic, the Diederik Stapel story on the European side of the Atlantic. And I think that when we're dealing with data fraud, we want to catch these folks as quick as possible. And I'm not over concerned with too much punishment if people are in fact guilty. But I'm fascinated by the fact that that's not the fundamental threat to integrity in the social sciences. I was preparing a talk on bounded ethicality in late 2011 in my home office in Berkeley, where I was visiting. And I was fascinated by two papers that were in press at the time. One of them was by my colleague at HBS, Leslie John, and George Loewenstein and Prelec, where they did a survey using Prelec's truth serum survey method, which is designed to get more truthful responses. And they basically attempted to find out how common are these behaviors among social scientists. And I'm not going to talk about number 10, because that's the bad stuff that I talked about earlier. I want to talk about the other 9, which they call questionable research practices, and I call the bounded ethicality of researchers, because 1 through 9 are things that lots of perfectly nice social scientists had been doing for decades. And we had even been teaching our doctoral students to do these things. As reviewers, we had been encouraging authors to do these things to make the story more interesting or to save space in the journal. And all of these basically erode the quality of science, and they increase the likelihood of being able to find out things to be true that just happen to not be true, or what we now call false positives. Okay? These are all bad behaviors, and lots of social scientists who had been engaged in these behaviors were doing bad things without thinking about the fact that they were doing anything wrong. And we all kind of had the statistical knowledge to know that if you get 3 tries at finding significance, that you're more likely to get the result than if you only got 1 try, and therefore the famous p is less than 0.05 test is contaminated once we're engaged in any or all of these tasks. And what Simmons et al. Do is that they show, using 4 of those 9 researcher bad practices, that basically if you torture your data enough with quite random data using just 4 of these tools, you got about a 50-50 chance of forcing your data to speak. Okay. So the next question becomes sort of, how do we respond? Okay. And I was in my, actually, I'm going to go back a second. I was in my office in Berkeley, and I started pulling things off of the web that famous social psychologists had written about this. And then I kind of reworded these comments to change, to protect the guilty. Okay? And what's interesting about this list is that I created it simply from the quotes, again, of famous social psychologists. And when I was all done, all I had to do was reorder it, and I had the same list that had been used consistently and that Anne and I had written a couple of years earlier to describe how tobacco, auditing, and climate deniers had delayed change. Okay? Again, I'm not accusing all social psychologists of doing this, but the goal here is to create a debate that's long enough for some of these folks to retire before they actually need to deal with this problem. And certainly the most popular of these suggestions is to call for more research. We need to know how big the problem is, and we need to consider all the different courses of action, when in fact, I would argue we could put we could take 3 smart psychologists, I'll go with the 3 to my left, and if we put them in a room and told them to come up with a good set of solutions, within 4 hours they could solve 90–95% of the problem. But in fact, what's occurred is that we're delaying change. Social sciences are being attacked for our behaviors. The media is confusing these boundedly ethical acts with data fraud, and then eventually we'll blame the media for not understanding the story right. When the mistake has been that academics haven't gotten ahead of this problem to identify the problems that exist and to begin to take the necessary corrective actions. Okay. I highlight this not because I think social psychologists or social scientists are bad people, but because good people do bad things without knowing that we're doing anything wrong, and we don't step in quick enough and notice what's going on and take the corrective actions that I think that we need to take. So with that, I'm going to stop and allow you to spend more time with my colleagues.
Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to save all comments and questions for after all three have spoken. You can see why I adore this man. And I'll introduce now to you my colleague Josh Green. Josh is John and Ruth Hazel Associate Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. He rose to fame as a mere toddler, that is to say, when he was a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, with discoveries that could only have emerged from training as a philosopher, and then as a cognitive neuroscientist, and then as a social psychologist. His expertise is moral cognition, and he has single-handedly turned this into an area that every entering PhD student in psychology now wants to study. Josh's goal is to understand how moral judgments are shaped by gut reactions that psychologists call automatic processes, and then contrast them with deliberative processes that require deeper reasoning and self-control. From his widely influential work, Josh has shown that there may be no such thing as a dedicated moral sense or moral faculty. Instead, he argues, systems that are not specifically dedicated to moral reasoning, such as those that are more generically implicated in general cognitive control, in reward seeking, in action representation, in sensory imagery, that these come to be used in the service of moral cognition. And we're very much looking forward to a book of his that will appear very soon called Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. So welcome, Josh.
It's hard, you know, to not see these talks today through the lens of this week's events, and there's part of me that feels that there's something a little off, a little inappropriate about applying at least my own detached style of analysis when our feelings are still so raw. But what I'd like to do at least is I guess, bring this detached analysis to bear, I think, on the two things we feel most strongly when events like this week's events occur. One is we look at the people on what we see, I think quite rightly, as the wrong side and say, how can they do this? How can they be so evil, or how can they be so bad? And then we also marvel at the wonderful good things that the heroes do, the people who ran towards the bombs instead of running away. And so what I'm going to try to do is bring out, in perhaps an overly cold, detached academic way, the underlying cognitive and ultimately evolutionary structure behind that duality, behind the badness of them and the goodness of us, and how to make sense of that in a way that can move us forward. So in particular, I want to introduce two ideas, one of which has already been introduced to some extent. The first I call the tragedy of common-sense morality, which is a sequel of sorts to a familiar parable. And then the dual process moral brain, and this gets at some of the issues that Max already raised. So we'll start with the tragedy of the common-sense morality in the original parable on which it's based, which is, of course, the tragedy of the commons. This is a famous parable from the ecologist Garrett Hardin, who wrote in the late 60s and was concerned, among other things, about the problem of overpopulation, and he compared that social dilemma to the following parable. So you have a bunch of herders on this pasture, and they all have their herd, and they each face a dilemma. That is, when they add animals to their herd, they get to take those animals to market and they get money. But the animals graze on a common pasture, and so they share the costs of raising those animals collectively. And so when a herder asks, should I add another animal to my herd, she thinks, well, I get a nice piece of change when I bring that animal to market, and I don't pay very much myself to keep it alive because it's on the commons that's shared by everybody. And so everybody has a financial incentive to add more animals and to add more animals. And when you do that enough, what happens is the commons is eroded and there's nothing left for everybody. And so the paradox is that when everybody does what's in their self-interest, everybody ends up worse off. That's the tragedy of the commons. And it arises from the fundamental tension between individual rationality and collective rationality. What's good for me as an individual and what's good for us as a group. And this is, I think, the fundamental problem of social life, not just for humans, but for cells developing in the primordial ooze. It was the fact that there was a tension between what we can do as an individual and what we can do collectively that gave rise to life on Earth. A longer story. So, but merely saying, okay, so the solution is that we should be cooperative. And that's what really morality is about. But just saying, let's be cooperative doesn't answer the question. Cooperation on what terms? How should sheep be allotted? Does every family get the same number of sheep? Does every individual get the same number of sheep? Do we have health insurance for sick sheep? And so on and so forth. There is no one answer to the question, how should we be cooperative? And this gives rise to a different problem, the problem that I named earlier. So you can have these herders over here who say, well, here's how we're going to solve the cooperation problem. We're not only going to have a common pasture, we're going to have a common herd. In that way, there's no tension between individual interest and collective interest because there is no individual interest. We're all in this together 100%. These are the communist herders. And on the other side, we have the pure individualist herders who say, well, we can solve this problem. We're not going to have, we're not going to have a common herd, and we're not going to have a common pasture. We're going to divide up the land into different plots. Everybody gets their own little pasture, everybody gets their own herd, and all we have to do is stay out of each other's business, and we'll be fine. And there are other ways that groups can organize themselves. Groups can have different gods that they pray to, different books that they read for moral guidance, different customs that guide their lives, and as a result, different views about things like, can women be herders? Can gay people be herders? There are a host of what I call proper nouns, specific authorities, texts, practices that are specific to tribes, tribal proper nouns that govern the life within these mutual, individually but separately cooperative societies. And for now, things are okay. And then this happens. The forest in between them burns down, and after a while, it's reduced to ash, and then there's this nice pasture after the rains come in between, and they both rush in, and the question is, how are they going to get along? This is the modern world. This is the modern problem right here. It's not, I think, fundamentally about good versus evil. It is fundamentally about different groups with different ideals, different cooperative practices, trying to get along in a common space. And I call this, although you can't see it there, the tragedy of common sense morality, because each group has its own intuitive sense of how noble, good, non-evil herders ought to live, and yet they're different senses, and they all can affect each other in nice ways and in nasty ways, and that is the fundamental problem. Okay, so I said, so now you see the problems of the new pastors all around us. So on an individualist end, we have someone like Ron Paul. That picture comes from a debate in the Republican primary when he was still hoping to be president. Wolf Blitzer of CNN asked him, what do you do if there's a guy who decides not to get health insurance and then all of a sudden he needs it, he's on death's door? Do you pay to keep him on life support? And Paul couldn't quite make up his mind. He said, well, his friends, his churches, his family, his tribe should take care of him. And Blitzer pressed him and said, well, okay, suppose his tribe can't help him. What should the government do? And he didn't really answer, but the crowd had an answer. At least some people, they said, let him die. These are the individualist herders. You make your bed, you lie in it. And then on the other side, we have the famous viral video coming from Massachusetts Senator now Elizabeth Warren, who said, no one got rich on their own. Whether you realize it or not, we're all in this together. And she is coming from not a communist tribe, but a more collectivist view of the new pastors. And we saw this in the Occupy Wall Street protests. What do the individuals at the top owe others? And we see the problem of proper nouns coming up in issues like gay marriage, what laws, what rules, what ideals should we live by, even ones governing private behavior and not behavior that's necessarily out in public, so to speak, on the pastures. And you can draw your own conclusions about this week's events. So the tragedy of the common sense morality is the higher order moral problem. The original moral problem is how do we get individuals to live together as a group? And the modern moral problem is how do we get groups to live together in the modern world? Groups that are not inherently evil, but groups that are differently cooperative and that have different moral ideals. Next idea, the dual process moral brain. So I like to compare the brain to this camera, which I got a few years ago for my birthday. And this camera is good for a bumbler like me because it has these automatic settings here. So most of the time I don't do anything fancy. I'm just taking a picture of my kid or a mountain from far away. And so I put it in portrait mode or landscape mode, and it's point and shoot. Every once in a while I want to do something fancy, and I'll put the camera in manual mode, and I can adjust the f-stop and everything by hand. And what's great about having both of these options is that they allow us to navigate the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. So the point and shoot settings are very efficient for obvious reasons, but they're not very flexible. They're good for what they're good for, and that's about it. The manual mode is very flexible, but it's not very efficient. You have to know what you're doing. You might make a mistake. And this is the theme of Daniel Kahneman's wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that we have these two different ways of thinking, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, and they're good for different things. And as goes the brain in general, so goes the moral brain. So returning now, taking this idea of gut reactions, automatic responses, and manual mode, point and shoot versus manual mode, we'll apply this to the original tragedy of the commons. And this is work done with David Rand and Martin Novak. So we have essentially the tragedy of the commons in the lab. We play what's called a public goods game. Economists have been doing this, and psychologists have been doing this for decades now. You have, in our case, 4 people come in. They each get an allotment of money, and they can put their money into a common pool. And then that common pool gets doubled by the experimenter, and then they each get an equal share of the commons, each get an equal share of the pool. Now, if you do the cooperative thing, what you do is you put in some or ideally all of your money. That maximizes the pool. It all gets doubled, and everybody comes out ahead. That's the collectively rational thing to do. The individually rational thing to do is to not put anything in, because you get to keep your original set allotment of money, and you get to have your share of the commons. So it's me versus us in the lab in this very simple and admittedly stylized way. And what we wanted to know is what are people's gut reactions? Do people participate in an automatic sort of, cooperate in an automatic sort of way, and then perhaps it's manual mode that says, no, you shouldn't do that, save your money? Or is it the other way around, where you have this gut reaction that says, I want to keep my money, but then you think, no. Moral ideals, I should be cooperative. And so what we did was first we just looked at people's reaction times. And what we found is that the faster people made their decision, the more likely they were to cooperate. And you can see this here quite starkly, that again, as decision time goes out, cooperation levels go down. And then we said, well, let's manipulate this. We'll put people under time pressure, or we'll give people extra time to think. And what we found is that when we put people under time pressure, they cooperated more, put more money into the common pool. And when we had them think more, they cooperated less. Now, you might think, well, this means people are naturally good or genetically good, and I think that you shouldn't draw that conclusion. In fact, our evidence suggests that this is quite sensitive to context and quite sensitive to people's personal history. And as Lee Ross demonstrated a while ago, you can even just change the name of a game like this. Call it the Wall Street game or call it the community game, and you'll get very different results. So this is very contextually sensitive behavior, but nevertheless, you can see the interaction between automatic settings in manual mode in this case. So how does morality work more generally? And this is just one illustration. Basically, the tragedy of the commons, when it gets solved, and it doesn't always, gets solved generally by feelings. We have feelings that motivate ourselves to be good. I love you, or I care about you, or I have goodwill towards you even if you're a stranger. And then we have negative feelings that motivate us to be good. I would be ashamed, or I would feel guilty if I did otherwise. And then we motivate other people in a positive way. You have my gratitude for being a nice cooperator. And in a negative way, you get my anger and my contempt and my disgust if you don't. And this is a view of how morality works that's been building for a long time, really since Darwin. So to sort of summarize so far, what we have is that we have selfish intuitions, as we all know, to put me ahead of us, but we also have social intuitions that allow the collective good to triumph over the individual good. And these generally work with automatic settings. Okay, so that's a nice story. Now we come back to this, the modern problem, the tragedy of common sense morality. What is going to get us out of this pickle? And we can see our moral machinery failing us all over the place and also succeeding. So this is a wonderful study done by Benedict Hermann, spent about, I think, 5 years going around the world and having people in different cities play repeated public goods games, so the tragedy of the commons. And it's repeated where the same people play over and over again, and they can punish each other for their behavior. So punishment means I pay, let's say, $1 to make somebody else lose $3. And interesting things happen in different places. If you look in Boston and Copenhagen and St. Gallen, you see that cooperation levels start out high and they stay high. In other places such as Seoul and Melbourne and Chengdu, they start out kind of in the middle, and then as people punish each other and say, hey, come on, be good, put your money in the common pool, things end up pretty well. But in other places, here, Istanbul, Riyadh, and Athens, cooperation starts out low and it stays low. And this is an amazing thing because it's really a controlled experiment. All these people are in the exact same situation, and they all have the exact same opportunities, and yet you see very different results. Now, this doesn't mean that people in Istanbul, Riyadh, and Athens are not good people. What it means is that for whatever reason, their cultural background makes it harder for them to cooperate with strangers in a strange situation. And when they looked around to see what is it that differs here, the number one thing that jumped out is what they called antisocial punishment. In the places where cooperation was generally low, down here, what you saw was not only did people not cooperate, some people punish people for being cooperative, as if to say, don't you fool, don't go in for this collectivist crap. When we work here, we work between you and me, and they're sort of irritated and annoyed by the idea that they should be contributing to this common pool with these other strangers. Very different success and failure rate. Now, and of course, it's my spin on this to say which of these outcomes are good or bad, but they are certainly different. Another place where we see failures is when it comes to what you might call tribalism in its rawest form. So economists Marianne Bertrand and Sendel Melanchthon, who's here, sent out identical resumes to employers, and they found that the ones that had black-sounding names like Lakeisha and Jamal instead of white-sounding names like Emily and Greg got a lot more, about 50% more callbacks from employers. Jennifer Eberhardt and colleagues have demonstrated in a chilling study that men who have more stereotypically African-American features are more likely to get the death penalty, even controlling for everything you can try to control for. Recently, Seth Stevens-Davidowitz produced a Google map of searches involving the word nigger, mostly people looking for racially charged jokes, and found that these did a good job of predicting the advantage that Kerry as a Democratic candidate had over Obama, and amounting and other white candidates as well. This has an enormous effect on elections. And Mazarine's own work, working with Nehemajan and others, showed that even in monkeys, people are more, the individuals are more quick to associate nasty things like spiders that they don't like with faces of members of other groups. And we see this in the brain, and in the interest of time, I won't get into the neuroanatomy. A quick study done by a wonderful undergraduate named Jay Musin, looking at the length of our heartstrings. So this is building on famous thought experiments by philosophers Peter Singer and more recently Peter Unger. We asked people, so suppose you're vacationing in some lovely poor country and there's a terrible typhoon and there's devastation along the coast. You're up in your little cottage in the mountains. You're fine. You're safe. You've got everything you need. But you can help the relief effort by making a donation to an organization on the ground. Do you have an obligation to give something? And in this sample, 68% of people said you should make a substantial donation. We then asked a different group of people, suppose it's not you over there. They haven't seen the first case. Your friend is over there and has a smartphone, is showing you everything that's going on, and you can also donate. You can donate over the internet just as well. Do you have an obligation to help these people? And about half as many people do. Keeping everything you know is the same. Everything that you can do is the same. It's just this feeling of distance. Now, whether you think we should be more like this or we should be more like that, this certainly seems to be a kind of inconsistency here. Our heartstrings seem to be fickle. They can be pulled from shorter distances, but not as well from longer distances. So how do we solve that larger problem? Well, as I've said, I think this nature's solution and culture's solution to the original tragedy of the commons is our moral emotions, our positive emotions that make us want to do good and that make us feel bad about not doing good, and the negative emotions that we heap on others when they do what we think is bad. That's the basic way we become moral beings. So how do we solve this? The tragedy of common sense morality, where we have different intuitions about what's right or what's wrong. Well, if morality is what allows individuals within a group to get along, then what we need is something like a metamorality. That is, a kind of higher order moral system that can adjudicate among competing moral systems in the way that basic tribal morality adjudicates among competing individual interests. So where do we get that? Well, here I'm going to follow Susan Nyman and give an unfashionable answer. That this is, I think, was the fundamental project of Enlightenment ethics, trying to think what are the deeper universal principles by which we can all live. But I'm going to be even more unfashionable and suggest that the people who got it right were the greatest moral geeks of all time, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. That's a longer talk and a longer book. But the basic idea is that what I think they did was they took the golden rule, which everybody ascribes to in principle, but lacks a kind of toothiness, and gave it teeth by identifying a common currency that all people share, which is the currency of experience, happiness on the positive end, suffering on the negative end, and said, look, this may not fit with all of our intuitions, but this is what we need to do. This is the higher standard to which we need to appeal if we're going to resolve differences among competing tribal moral ideals. And how am I doing on time? Oh, good. All right. I was worried I was going to. So just some historical highlights here. And I mentioned this not just to say, yay, utilitarians, but in particular to highlight the psychological dynamic at work. So this is Jeremy Bentham in one of the first defenses of what we now call gay rights, at a time when the idea of defending gay rights was truly absurd. And he recognized the absurdity himself. He said, I have been tormenting myself for years to find, if possible, a sufficient ground for treating gays with the severity with which they are treated at this time of day by all European nations. That is punishable by death. But upon the principle of utility, I can find none. What that means is, I know this is a horrible, terrible thing to do, but I'm trying to think, how does this actually harm the greater good? Because that's the principle that I've arrived at. And I can't do it. And so he said this crazy, absurd thing, which is, maybe we should just let people live their sex lives and stay out of it. This was patently absurd at the time, and we're just now, 2 centuries later, coming around to appreciate the far-thinking, Bentham's willingness to question those gut reactions that he himself shared. Now here's John Stuart Mill talking about women's rights, and he says, but it would be a mistake to suppose that the difficulty of the case here lies in the insufficiency or obscurity of the grounds of reason on which my conviction rests. The difficulty is that which exists in all cases in which there is a mass I can barely read it. Massive feeling to be contended against, and while the feeling remains, it's always throwing up fresh entrenchments of arguments to repair any breach made in the old. And this should sound familiar from Max's talk. That this is what Mill recognized is, look, it's pretty obvious if you think about it in a detached, abstract kind of way why women should be given the same rights as men. But these arguments keep coming up, and they're very strongly felt. And what their genius was to detach themselves from the gut feelings of their day. And now, for many of us at least, what was a crazy, geeky, abstract idea now feels like common sense, although it doesn't feel like common sense to everybody. And Bentham and Bill pretty much got everything right in the 19th and in the 18th and 19th century. I'm sure that's an oversimplification. But incredible how right they were. So to begin to sum up, I think we have 2 fundamentally different kinds of moral problems that we want to distinguish between. One is the problem of me versus us, the tragedy of the commons, getting individuals to get along, to not rob each other, to not lie, to not steal. And then we have the fundamentally modern problem, the tragedy of common sense morality, that is getting groups with different moral ideals to get along with each other. And we have 2 different kinds of moral thinking, fast and slow, automatic settings, and manual mode. And I think that the trick to progress is to get the right kind of problem lined up with the right kind of thinking. And so how to be good or how to be non-evil, here is the hypothesis I'd like to put on the table. When it comes to me versus us, to the tragedy of the commons, to sort of basic decency among our fellows, think fast, trust your gut reactions, put your money into the common pool, rush towards the bomb to save the other people whose lives are on the precipice. But when it comes to the tragedy of common sense morality, when it comes to our interests versus their interests, our values versus their values, the modern problems that divide not the Bernie Madoffs from the rest of us, but that divide one people from another people, one culture from another culture, that's when we need to think slow. And for reasons I haven't fully justified but have hinted at, I think the way forward is the way of Bentham and Mill. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing the rest.
So are we switching now to the fuddy-duddy PC again? Or are we staying with the Mac? Hi. Yeah, do you want to come and switch it? Okay, all right. So while I introduce Lee Ross, we'll get the switch done. Lee Ross is at Stanford. He's Federal Credit Union Professor of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. Lee is an iconic figure in psychology, and you will soon see why. He has the distinction of having discovered multiple counterintuitive features about human minds and behavior, and in such persuasive ways demonstrated them to us that they're now part of the canon that every student must learn. One example is the fundamental attribution error, the error in attributing behavior to factors that reside within the person rather than to situations outside the person. Another influential result is something that Lee discovered called the hostile media effect, which emerged from his famous study of the Beirut massacre, in which he showed that pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian participants see the same news report as favoring the other side. And yet another, the false consensus effect, in which we see our own judgments and behaviors as commonplace and appropriate to the circumstances, and those that are not our own as uncommon and deviant. Lee has studied some of the most important issues that humans on the planet face by studying how we reason about them, whether it's global warming, social security, healthcare, women and minorities, and academic institutions. He's done it all. He helped to found the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation. Of interest to us today is his phenomenal work on interpersonal and intergroup conflict, work through which he has sought to find ways for more successful negotiation in public peace processes in places like Northern Ireland and the Middle East. For all this and many other gifts he's given to psychological science, he's been honored over and over again, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, William James Fellow of the APS, and Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. So welcome, Lee.
Yeah. I'm going to do two crazy things today, or at least unwise. We heard in the first panel these wonderfully fluent philosophical discourses, and I remember whenever I talk in the same panel with philosophers, they say, "You social psychologists are very brave. You pretend to have talks." But you just get up there and talk. You haven't actually done the work. You actually haven't written anything. And my usual defense is to say, well, yes, but we, on the other hand, have some evidence. So the other rational thing to do is to present a lot of evidence. But today's talk is going to be a more philosophical talk, a talk with very little data, more conjecture than evidence, and incidentally, a critique rather than a crediting of some of our most celebrated research and celebrated researchers. And yet I'm not going to read a talk. I'm just going to talk off the top of my head. But I do have slides because I'm 70 years old, and it's very comforting to not have to say, now, what was the next thing I wanted to say? So let me proceed. My talk today actually starts out with a thesis, and it says that sane people rarely, if ever, act in an evil manner unless they can successfully rationalize their actions. The problem is that people are very adept, are very good at rationalizing their actions, not only their own personal actions, but the sins of omission and the sins of commission of their society. So I'm situating the problem of evil as the problem of rationalization. I want to reflect a little bit about what is perhaps social psychology's most famous experiment, and certainly the most pertinent experiment on the problem of evil. It, in interesting ways, interacts with and reverberates back and forth with Hannah Arendt's famous thesis about the banality of evil, and that's Stan Milgram's study. I think most of you know it. It showed that if you took ordinary working people in New Haven who were recruited by handbills and put in a particular situation where they were told to deliver ascending levels of shock to what they thought was a learner, actually an experimental Confederate, and in the behavioral trap that Milgram had cunningly arranged. He showed that roughly 2/3 of these ordinary people, none of whom were pathological, none of whom one would have thought of as evil in the normal course of things, nevertheless was willing to deliver a very potent subtetanizing electric shock to this innocent victim. The experiment is important not just in its specifics, but it also was a classic of situationism. It was in many ways the ultimate demonstration that you change the situation, or you engineer the situation, and you can make good people or ordinary people do very bad things. Milgram, alas, didn't run the Milgram experiment of virtue. I'm going to say a bit about that at the end. He didn't show how you can take ordinary good people and step by step carefully lead non-saints, ordinary good citizens, to do extraordinarily heroic things. More is the pity. I think that would have been an important experiment to do. But in any case, this dramatic demonstration continues to disturb us today, and continues to be food for thought in terms of really understanding what the Milgram experiment was about. And really good social psychology experiments, like great works of fiction, have the property that successive generations look at the same piece of art, the same piece of work, and find new messages in it, new lessons. And increasingly, the lesson that I took from the Milgram situation was not the general one about the agentic role and the bad things we do when we abrogate personal responsibility and say it's okay because someone told us to do it, but rather how important it was to look at and focus on some of the very specific features of the Milgram situation that accounted for its potency. So the most famous of these, of course, was the step-by-step nature of the induction into evil. And I think that is self-evident, that there was a trap in the experiment, that the person, once they agreed to be in the experiment, once they delivered the initial shock, once they were in a situation where they actually had a contract with the victim, whereby the victim wasn't protesting, the victim was continuing to respond, why should they feel any obligation to stop giving shocks? And they gradually begin to escalate upward. So the initial rationalizations are clear. The experimenter takes responsibility and incidentally can be presumed to know more, to be more expert than the subject. And secondly, the learner didn't quit. You blame the victim, in a sense. And adding to this, the cunning feature of it, that Milgram started out the experiment by having the subject initially take a shock at about the fourth, or what they believe was the fourth or fifth level on that machine. So they were saying, I'm not doing anything bad. I already took a greater shock than I gave, or than I'm giving at the beginning of the experiment. It's interesting how many regimes that indoctrinate torturers expose the torturers to some torture initially. At some point, the subject stops responding, and that's a crisis. The subject has withdrawn request, has withdrawn his permission, in a sense. Stopping at any point before that is very difficult, and if people are going to ever quit, that's when they quit. The third of people who quit basically quit then. Note that if they don't quit then, they have a moral dilemma and a psychological dilemma as well. And the psychological dilemma is the question of not why should I stop, but why should I stop now? And many moral problems that have the step-by-step feature have the property that however you justify your behavior, to a given point in time, that justification now gets in the way when you face the problem. If I should have stopped at the 17th shock level, if I try and stop at the 17th shock level, I have to justify why I didn't stop at the 16th shock level. And conversely, however I justified the 16th shock makes it very hard to stop at the 17th shock stop. But there are two other non-obvious situational features that have a lot to do with how institutions create evil. An interesting thing to note about the Milgramic situation, something that Stan actually didn't comment on, is that there was no obvious exit. There was no way to stop. The subject, almost always, we're told, said, okay, I don't want to give any more shocks. They'd say initially things like, well, I think you better check on that man. Are you sure this is okay? And Milgram just shrugged and said, yes, just go ahead, give the next level of shock. The experiment requires it. We can imagine what word we might substitute for the X demands it. The X requires that you go on. To stop, the person had to step outside the role and say, you're in no position to tell me I have to go on. I can quit. I'm a free agent. Go to hell. And that was what subjects found it hard to do. They tried to protest within role. They tended to say, I'm sure you're a good experimenter and a good citizen, but please, can I, in my role, not do this? And Milgram seemed not to understand the answer. He seemed not to understand the dilemma. He just said, go on. And so the subjects went on. As a thinking experiment, I want you to imagine, since we can't do these kinds of experiments anymore, that there was a button. And the button said, if you wish to discontinue the experiment, press the button. It's only a thinking experiment, but I think it's a convincing one that the majority of people would have pushed the button. The second non-obvious feature of the Milgram situation was the lack of clarity. When one thinks about it, the situation made absolutely no sense. So you're in an experiment looking at the effects of punishment on learning, and you've been giving these shocks, and now the victim is no longer responding. The level of shock is being put there, and you're saying, well, this doesn't make sense. But not only that doesn't make sense, why doesn't it make sense? Why isn't Milgram concerned about this innocent victim? When I said an ordinary thing, I think you better go check on that man. You better see how he's doing. Milgram just shrugs and says the experiment requires you to make sense. It requires you to go on. And I want to suggest that in situations where great evil is required and is perpetrated, it has these two features typically. Not just the step-by-step process, but also the system makes sure there is no ready, easy channel for disobedience, for stepping outside the situation. And the other is the norm is made very explicit that you must obey blindly. I don't have to tell you why you should follow your orders. And the converse of this is if you wanted to create a moral system, one of the things that's very important to provide is the equivalent to that button that says, if you are questioning this, here is what you do. Of course, it can be a metaphorical button. It can be a phrase that you use. Here is the phrase you could tell a soldier, if at some point you think that you are given an order that violates our understanding of moral conduct of war, all you have to do is say, please, sir, I'm holding up 2 fingers. And it's no accident that systems that demand obedience demand blind obedience and provide no such exits. Okay, well, I want to say a little bit about the relationship between rationalization and a phenomenon that social psychologists talked about a lot, and that's cognitive dissonance. It was our finest hour, in a sense. It was when it was fun to be a social psychologist. Nothing was more fun than the theory of cognitive dissonance and the ability to generate non-obvious predictions and show things like if you want someone to internalize a message, pay them as little as possible, not pay them as much. And Leon had great fun, and he was a great psychologist and a great researcher. But what Festinger et al., for a lot of reasons, ranging from the individualism of the society to the particular time and his effort to establish psychology as a distinct science, the emphasis in psychology was always on the behavior of the single individual. But of course, if we want to understand wrongdoing, and particularly the rationalization of wrongdoing, the vitally important thing to understand is that it isn't an individual phenomena. It isn't a single individual saying, I have a moral dilemma. How can I solve that moral dilemma? I know I can say or think or do X. That wrongdoing, great wrongdoing, is systemic. It occurs within the context of a system. People are very adept at rationalizing, but they rationalize in systems that help them a great deal. And most great evils, genocide, slavery, apartheid, even exercises in extreme social Darwinism, like the potato famine in Ireland, all involve collective and systemic rather than individual rationalization. There were leaders, there was ideology, there was propaganda, there was restriction of dissent, there was the encouragement of pluralistic ignorance, and these were all parts of the phenomena. They help explain when and why good people, or maybe we should just say ordinary people, stand by the wayside. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other side of the story. So what accounts for the cases when people surprisingly are able to stand outside the system and succeed? And I want to talk a little bit, again, without experimental data, but about real-world events. So I hope, if you don't know about it, some of you read the important book about John Karski, who was a Polish official, and he had been smuggled into and out of the one of the concentration camps, and went around the world. Pardon?
The ghetto force.
Well, he was in the Warsaw. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he in there gave accounts of what had gone on in the Belzec extermination camp. That was specifically what had happened. But the interesting thing is he went around the world encountering various people. His main mission was to talk about the resistance, the Polish resistance, but in passing, he also was encouraged to say a little bit about what he had heard about the extermination camps, not just about the resistance. And he met with Justice Frankfurter, and Frankfurter, I should say, this is a first-hand account, by the way. I heard Karski give this talk, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. And when he talked to Karski, to Frankfurter, Frankfurter very quickly said, I want to talk to you in private, and said, what's this I hear about the Jews? And he told him the horrors that had been going on, and famously, Frankfurter said, and there's two different versions, we're told that he said, I do not believe you. And then when the Polish ambassador who was there vouched for Karski's irreproachable honesty, Frankfurter responded, he said, I did not say that he's lying. I said that I don't believe him. Now what's interesting about that is when he talked at Stanford, just before he died, he said something slightly different, and I actually find it more plausible. he said that what Frankfurter said was, "I can't believe this." And I give this example because I met with Karski after, and I said to him, "Well, what do you think Frankfurter meant when he said, 'I can't believe you'? Did he mean simply, 'I don't believe you, I don't think it's true'? Did he mean, 'I can't believe anything that bad would really happen, it would be too painful'? Or did he mean, as an official in the American administration, 'I can't allow myself to believe you because if I believed you, I would be compelled to take action. And I can't take action. Therefore, I can't believe you.'" Anyway, that's the story. So let me switch now to the people who somehow or other didn't rationalize, didn't succeed. And I want to talk about a very remarkable book called Quiet Heroes by he's actually a Canadian psychiatrist, Andre Stein. And he had been a child of the Holocaust. He had been in a concentration camp and treated horribly, and wrote a terrible book, and I mean terrible in the sense of its effect on you, when you read about the cruelty he had experienced. And he was very troubled by this. It led him to become a psychiatrist, in fact, and he was advised by a Catholic theologian at St. Michael's College in Canada. As a personal healing experience, he needed to have some contact with people who had not been indifferent, people who had been Holocaust helpers, in particular people who had saved or hidden Jewish children. And as it happened, there was a rather strangely significant number of them in his own city, in Toronto. And this particular group were primarily Frisian farmers who had helped to hide and rescue Jewish children. And Stein took on this project of what did they have in common, what characterized these people, what made them special. And it's an interesting book because as a psychiatrist, he's disappointed by what he finds. He doesn't find a common core. He said to some extent, the story was the Milgram experiment of virtue. Hardly any of these people said, "I think I'm going to be a heroic rescuer and I'm going to hide and transport Jewish children and put my life in jeopardy." What they typically had done initially was a small act. They had agreed to hide children for a single night. They had agreed to provide some food. But then when they tried to do this, it turned out to be insufficient. It didn't get the job done. The people who said they only had to hide them for a day said you have to hide them for a longer time. And then they became real people to them. And then they became ill and they needed medicine. And so they went and got medicine. And so he's saying, yes, that was true, but is it just a story of the banality of virtue? And Stein says no. And he says, well, maybe there was a couple of things. These people were very puzzled by the behavior of their countrymen. And he says what most characterized them was almost a cognitive or intellectual failure. They weren't good at rationalizing. They weren't good at doing this, that when their neighbors said, "Why should I put my children at risk to save these strangers? I have an obligation to the people I have tight ties to, not loose ones." And they said, "But that really wasn't the question we were asked. We weren't asked, will you sacrifice your children? You were asked, were you willing to put yourself and your children at some risk for some period of time? Are you willing to do some small thing?" And that when they dealt with the specifics and the reality of it, rather than responding in a quick, thoughtless way, they couldn't rationalize. So that was part of it. They had a kind of intellectual failure. And the second was that they maintained an integrity of self, that they seemed to spend time saying, would I have in the past, if you had asked me, how would I have behaved? What should I do in the future. And they were unable to say, I'm going to keep my head down and not think too hard. They kept thinking about what was consistent with who they had always known. And many of these rescuers ultimately ended up having to leave their homeland because after this, it was too uncomfortable to remain in their homes. Uncomfortable in both ways. It was uncomfortable because no one wanted them to be there, and also they didn't want to be there any longer. So let me close with a final case of a more active sort of resistance, and it's the saga of the White Rose Society. So I think many of you know about this. The Holocaust depended obviously on monstrous deeds by thousands, but also small acts of complicity by hundreds of thousands. People who, as we say, didn't man the crematoria, but they sold the barbed wire, or they just cheered when others cheered, or they simply remained silent in spite of their misgivings. And remaining silent in spite of your misgivings contributes to a sense where people think that maybe their misgivings are not as widely shared as they really were. So against that background, we have the futile efforts, rather pathetic, of the White Rose. These were the first and unfortunately not very common resistors, and it was Hans and Sophie Scholl and a few of their friends and their philosophy professor, Christopher Probst, who gave small stuff. They printed some leaflets. They had access to a mimeograph machine, and the Nazis took a while to find it. They distributed a few leaflets. In one particular case, a leaflet was smuggled out, and they managed to, the British copied it and dropped it. They were eventually caught, and they went to the guillotine. Hopeless, stupid, idealistic, waste of time, accomplished nothing against the might of the German regime. They also had some graffiti. Yet here's the monument to the White Rose that was in Germany now. So this is a rose made up of leaflets, and that was the idea. But what was the significance? What was the moral significance of the White Rose and other heroic dissenters and resistors? And that is, they attached unwelcome moral significance to compliance and even silence. That if a single person resists, then they give the message resistance is possible. They make people see the act of doing nothing as a form of compliance, and that's the heroic significance of it. It's interesting that Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote so much about freedom and responsibility, he had been in the French underground, and they had talked about what was the responsibility, and here the great moral philosopher was extremely pragmatic. He said, you have an obligation to resist for one day. 24 hours, they had a network, and 24 hours should be enough time for people to be aware you've been caught and to leave. So the obvious question is what makes some people, often people who like the White Rose Youth, were once supporters of a system, choose the path of resistance? Why don't they too make use of ready and tempting rationalization? That's the kind of psychological deep question. The shallower, more kind of question that experimental social psychologists like Josh and Mazarin and Max and I would ask is, what kind of institutions can you create that make people more likely to resist and to attach moral significance? I'll close with that. Thank you.
I have questions, but I have access to these people beyond this conference, so I'm going to hold off and just raise hands, and I'll call. Let's start with Susan, and can we get a mic up here?
Yep.
To the front? Right here in the front. And then who had their hand up next, so we can get the next mic lined up? Did somebody in the back have their hand up? Sure.
I have a question, and I'll try to keep it very short for each of the commentators. And let me start with you, Max. Auditors, about which I know nothing in this country. I don't work in the private sphere. I'm the head of a small public institution. But we, by law, are required to change our auditor every 3 years. Is there nothing like that in this country? And if not, why wouldn't that be a solution second question to Josh. I don't find the experiment that you talked about, the disparity between people who are in a country where a disaster occurs and the ones who see it on a cell phone, I don't find that contradictory at all. We all know that resources are limited. We make whatever choices we make about how to give to people in faraway places. But if you're actually in a country that has just experienced a disaster, and probably it's a third world country, and probably you're living better in the hotel than, or the cottage than they are anyway, don't the two attitudes that you talk about, gratitude and shame, do enough to account for the reason why you would feel some cause to give to them? And the third and perhaps more important question is to Lee. One is, what's the argument for why we can't do things like the Milgram experiment anymore? That is, given that nobody was actually being shocked, is the argument that it's unethical to present people with the limits on their own ethical behavior? And that's strange. And then I just want to end by saying that nothing against the White Rose, they were very moving. But I think it's really interesting that they are brought up always as an example of resistance when there are some quite successful examples of resistance against the Nazis, like the women of the Rosenstrasse. And I think one reason that the Scholl family is actually brought up is quite perverse, which is to suggest that if you tried to do anything against totalitarianism, it wouldn't accomplish anything and you'd be dead.
I think mine's the easiest, so I'll try to knock that one off and get to other stuff. So in our 97 paper, we advocated auditors only audit, that they work on fixed, non-fireable, non-renewable contracts, and auditors don't go working for their clients when they leave the auditor. So in your story, it's important not only that you rotate, but that you can't fire your auditor in the middle, or you still have a problem. I'm pretty sure that that Germany does not have a law requiring rotating auditors yet. So my guess is that it has something to do with not-for-profits or some other entity.
In the public sphere, we do. Yeah.
So right now, my impression is that the Netherlands is ahead of the rest of Europe in moving ahead on auditor rotation. Right now in the U.S., the AICPA is considering auditor rotation in a very serious way. I'm the guy they bring down to say you need to do even more so that they can potentially compromise on auditor rotation. My own view is that until we get sort of auditor rotation, no non-audit services, and you can't take jobs with your clients, we basically have a corrupt institution so that claiming independent auditing is a fraud. So we need to take multiple steps, but that's certainly one of them.
Josh.
Thanks for your question. I think to remind people, so this was this little experiment we did where you can either be someplace and contribute to the relief effort for a natural disaster, or you have the same information and the same ability, when people are nearby, they feel more of an obligation and not so much when they're far away. I think there's a sense in which this is puzzling, and there's a sense in which it's not. So in a purely descriptive sense, it's an interesting puzzle, but one that when you think about it can be solved, and I think you had the right idea and the data support this, that indeed these are psychologically different situations. And not only that there's a kind of plausible, reasonable logic to the psychological differences that are created there. It makes sense that we have special feelings for the people who are close to us in social space, but even in physical space. And so it's not that, the thought is not that this is inexplicable behavior, or that the psychological dispositions behind that behavior don't have a kind of value to them or don't make sense. The question is, at the ultimate normative level, this is what I meant when I said that it was puzzling, is does this make sense? And I think to see that, it's easiest to put this as a prospective question. Someone comes to you and says, there has been a terrible disaster, there's a typhoon, people are in badly need of food and medicine, there's an international relief agency that's there helping people, they desperately need donations, and I have a credit card and I can donate to that effort, should I do it? I think it would be kind of strange to say, well, that depends. How many feet away are these people? right? And when you put it like that, it's not a perfect experiment that we conducted, but if you take the premise of the experiment seriously, saying how many feet away, that doesn't seem to be what really matters. Instead, feet, miles, are correlated with things that might really matter a lot of the time, but might not matter all the time. And so my purpose in presenting that was not to say that this is an inexplicable part of our psychology or that there's nothing right about the psychology, but that there's also something puzzling about it and something that at the highest level might require a kind of moral correction. Does that?
Yeah, can I just add a little twist to that? Because it may be that because of the way you set it up for us, Josh, about two very different cultures or multiple different cultures now coming together and the clashes that happen. I had this interesting observation of my own behavior that when the tsunami hit Japan, it took me a few seconds to write a check. It took me a few more seconds to write an email to a colleague to find out how he was doing and to find out if his kids who were not in Japan could come to Boston instead of returning to Japan. All this happened within the first 24 hours. Months later, I was surprised that after a horrible hurricane had hit the southern part of the United States and affected largely Alabama and Mississippi, that I didn't even note it. I didn't think about it. I did not write a check. I had to force myself a week later to come to recognize that had happened. Why? Alabama is closer to me in distance, but people in Alabama are very far from me, whereas my friend in Japan is very close. So this question of identity crossed with physical distance is going to put us in a very different space, morally speaking, because the old notions of distance may not any longer matter. It may very well be deeper things like identity, and yet we have to ask that question of why should Alabama not have mattered to me in the same way as Japan did?
Yeah. Well, far be it from me to defend human subjects committees for the wisdom and gravity of their deliberative processes. I think it hinged to some extent on the issue, or at least giving them some credit, on the issue of informed consent. And that is, can you run a Milgram-type experiment and honor the requirement of informed consent? If the person is informed about it, they wouldn't show the behavior. Now, is it okay to not have informed consent? Well, normally we're called upon to do a kind of balancing act. It depends on how important, how threatening, etc. The Milgram experiment is kind of interesting because it's an enormously important learning experience for the subject. And the question is, do we have a right to impose an unwelcome learning experience on people? Well, of course, as a professor, I say, of course we do. If we're not going to give people the opportunity to experience unwelcome truths about themselves and about their society, what the hell are we here for? That's one of our primary missions. It's one of the ways in which psychologists and philosophers have something important in common. But there is this kind of Kantian issue too, and that is, do we have a right to say, well, I'm going to take this group of people and subject them to a difficult or unpleasant experience because the value to a whole bunch of other people will be great. And so I think, even though if you were to examine how it actually came about politically, it would become very boring and trivial, the deeper question about what obligation do we have to the people we engage in, whether it's in experiments or as teachers, what obligations do we have, what are the limits of those obligations, is actually quite a deep question. With regard to the interesting observation about why the white rose is talked about so much, I think it is the very futility of it. Of course, lots of people successfully resisted in the sense that they helped people, as the quiet heroes did. And so the question is there an obligation to engage in a kind of pathetic, useless resistance? And when does one do that, and why does one do that? And I don't think we can condemn people for not being willing to sacrifice themselves in the way that the White Rose people did, precisely because it wasn't helpful. It didn't save anyone. But I think there is a role for moral witness. And in this particular case, and we don't know that that's the reason that the White Rose youth did what they did, but the notion of how important it is to demonstrate that there is a choice, even if you're taking the easy path, to make people be aware of that. And you know, the other famous experiment in psychology, the Asch experiment, the conformity experiment, we know that if only one person doesn't go along, it doesn't matter if 50 people gave the wrong answer in the famous Asch experiment, if one person stands up and says, well, the right answer is X, and 49 people say the opposite, that one person liberates other people to stand up. So I think to some extent, the futility of it is the point.
I just want to say to Susan that there is an important person in this room for the question you asked about the Milgram experiment, and that's Herb Kelman. And if you just raise your hand, Herb. Okay, so there's Herb. He's more than 70 years old. And Herb actually may have known the Milgram grant proposal when first submitted. So he can tell you a lot about the decisions that went into what came, the fallout after that. And there was a question here. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's the heroism of the BDS movement, too, isn't it? The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Even though, practically speaking, it may be futile, it points up the complicity of people who are silent in Israel's occupation or America's support for it, or those that either buy products from Israel or supply products that go to support the occupation.
Yeah. Well, what can I say? This question, we say, so many wrongs, so many causes, which ones do we choose? How do we choose? And in some ways, it relates, Susan, to your question to Josh as well. And when I think about what virtue means, what heroism, what goodness means, to some extent it means you don't have to go out in the world and look for and decide which evil shall I confront. Well, the only thing that's really evil is doing nothing. So I don't condemn or condone people for the particular choice they make of which wrong has a big impact on them and which wrong doesn't. When someone says they're going to boycott Israel, of course we can say, you're boycotting Israel. Now, let's look at the list of all wrongdoing in the world. All countries doing wrong, all groups doing wrong, all industries in the United States doing wrong. How come Israel is the one that you're picking on? Now, if you were to tell me, the answer is, well, because I'm Jewish, and this has a special meaning to me. Or if you were to tell me, because I think Israel is a country that purports to be a country that takes moral issues and wrongful suffering seriously, that's the particular target, then I think that would be a very defensible point. But does every citizen have an obligation to be involved in this particular one? I would say no. I think you pick your sources, you pick your fights, you pick your causes. What's wrong is not to pick any. So I don't condemn anyone. I wouldn't say that you have an obligation to be involved in that one any more than you have an obligation to be involved in any other particular cause.
Yeah. So we have 6 minutes maybe, and we have 3 questions to take. Let's take one from here, one from you, and Jackie, and Barbara. Okay.
Just to follow. Which way are we going? Just to follow up on your question about earlier, the folks who rushed to the aid of those in the bombing, that's an individual quick reaction, the default on your camera setting, and be interested to know what your thoughts about that, as opposed to the last question about what institutions do we need to create And on the mass scale, Churchill called the Marshall Plan, for instance, one of the most unsorted acts in history, where institutionally the United States came to the aid of the devastated Europe. Can you comment a little bit about the positive side again?
Yeah, so I think that what you're illustrating there is really a virtuous loop in automatic and closed thinking. So this talk was sort of a tiny little summary of some of the ideas in the book. And at the front of the book, I have a quotation that I got from a fortune cookie many years ago, and it says, "The philosophy of one century is the common sense of the next." And that was illustrated as well by those quotations from Bentham and Mill. The idea that moral progress begins with a willingness to challenge the automatic settings. And that's a manual mode activity. That's stepping away from the gut reaction and saying what really makes sense. And then we can do things like Max is doing and say, well, what kinds of institutions can we create that will create the right kinds of gut reactions in people so that not everybody has to be a Jeremy Bentham, not everybody has to be a John Stuart Mill. Instead, we have institutions that give people the right ideas about how to behave in a pro-social way. And in fact, although you might take from the experiment I described with putting people under time pressure, the lesson is that that's our innate character. Actually, it's the result of cultural institutions. And other research, I talked about Benedict Hermann's a little bit, suggests that what actually gives people those pro-social intuitions when encountering strangers in a potentially cooperative enterprise is the larger institutional or cultural context in which their moral intuitions have been honed. So I think that in the best case, what you have is a kind of feedback loop that it requires both gut reactions and a willingness to question them.
So I have 3 questions, so I'll be very, very quick to her for Joshua Green. First of all, have you grappled with the complexities of the calculi that you must make in utilitarianism? Mm-hmm. Because as you know, Singer really missed the boat on that issue.
I disagree with that, but go on.
Yeah. Okay. Secondly, as far as the tsunami is concerned, tsunami victim, have you integrated the fairly recent discussion about identified victims into your thinking? And the third question for Professor Ross, which I thought was a very beautiful talk. I enjoyed it very much. But unfortunately, Susan has left the room, so I'll ask you the question. I mean, did the Geschwister Scholl know in advance that their action was going to be futile? I mean, it could have been a spark that set up a broader resistance. And in fact, we don't have hindsight when we initiate social or political movements. So I would just like you, since she's not here, to comment on that. Thank you.
So I'll try to be quick. So I think that the number one misunderstanding of Bentham and Mill's philosophy, which is horribly named utilitarianism, I prefer to call it deep pragmatism because I think that's what it really is that we should be walking around with spreadsheets all the time trying to actively add up what all the costs and benefits are for all the things that we might do. But if you think about it, if everyone were to do that, would things go well? No, of course not. And the point in the end, the ultimate value is to make the world as good as possible. So I think a proper understanding of the philosophy, and you see this more explicitly in people like R.M. Hare, but also in places in Peter Singer, is the understanding that we shouldn't be going around calculating all the time. Most of the time, we should be trusting our guts. But when there's a clash of values between groups, when we're in a situation where we're likely to be biased ourselves, that's when we need to step back and do a bit of calculating and pay close attention to the evidence. So
what about his example of the people who really get off on? What about his example of the people who really get off on child pornography, as opposed to the very few children statistically that they harm? I mean, I'm an advocate for children, and I don't think. I mean, I think if the total utility or the total enjoyment of these pornography people is, or pornography users, is greater than the harm to the children, then the harm to the children still trumps their enjoyment. And same for animals, by the way.
Well, I don't know what Singer's comments on that issue are, but if you're right that the greater good is served, and I agree with you by saying absolutely not evil to child pornography, if the evidence suggests that, I think that Peter Singer can be swayed. But we're not here to evaluate Peter Singer. The question is, what is the ultimate moral standard that we want to apply when we're stopping and thinking? And there, I think you and Peter Singer both agree whether or not he made a miscalculation at some point.
But can we jump to?
Okay, well.
Oh, sorry. The second question, remind me.
Victim. identified victim?
The short answer is yes. We tend to, so the phenomenon is, and this is another George Loewenstein, Deborah Small production, that we tend to respond more to people when there's an individual person who can be identified in some way. And Thomas Schelling talked about this as well. And just Loewenstein showed that even if you don't know anything about them, just the fact that they've been identified as an individual can pull your heartstrings stronger. And that's explicable, as I said to Susan Naiman, but also has its moral limits. It's an automatic setting that's useful, but I would say not flexible enough, that we should be willing to care about the masses as well as the person who's in front of us. And
let me jump and let me skip over that one, because in the interest of being a utilitarian, let me spread the goods here a little and ask Jackie if she'll ask her question, and you can talk to Lee later. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question to both Professor Baselman and Professor Green, which I think is the same issue. From a human rights sort of political agency point of view, both of you seem to be giving a very easy ride to governance and to states. I think when you talked, for example, about the tobacco industry or about auditing, and you suggested that the corporations should change their behavior, to me it really seemed like the wrong focus, because we know enough about the issue, whether or not they decide to emphasize particular aspects of it, to be making claims on government. And it's the government, policymakers that are choosing what to prioritize amongst the data they have. So I wonder why you focus your attention on the organizations that, of course, have a vested interest. And I guess the related point for you, Josh, is that I think very often the problem of the commons is not a problem of equally good positions which just differ, but it's actually power or interest. I mean, if you think of cities, for example, which is really our commons now, the reason we have maldistribution of space, that we have some people living in tiny places with inadequate heating and other people living in huge villas, is not because there are sort of competing ideas about what's good, but it's because, those who have more access to power and to influence manage to accrue a larger amount of the goods. So I'm just wondering why we're looking at this as if it's an even playing field.
So for the first part, first of all, thank you for your question, because I obviously wasn't clear in expressing what my views would be. So I don't actually have much hope of reforming even auditors, let alone tobacco or climate deniers. So I think that we're in need of dramatically stronger regulation. We need government officials with a stronger spine. We need to get rid of Citizens United, because these companies are buying the rules that govern them, so that they hide behind the fact that we're not violating any laws. Well, they bought the laws. So I'm in favor of dramatic government intervention, and I say that as somebody who believes in the free market. I simply think that corporations do a stunning job of destroying the nature of a free market through the distortions that occur through all the money in politics. Yeah, so I think I just wasn't clear in my view before.
And I'm glad you asked your question as well, because I also appreciate the opportunity to clarify. When I presented the tribes of the new pastures, I meant at first to be agnostic as to whether or not some tribes' views are better than others. And then later, when we got to the metamorality, adjudicating among, the idea was not that all tribes' moralities are equally good. And the question is, by what standard can we judge? And what I would say is that what we need on the new pastures in the modern world is to figure out what kinds of practices, institutions, expectations for individuals and for groups ultimately promote the greater good. And I'm confident that there are some tribes whose moral views are bad by that standard, and some that are much better, and that what's likely to emerge is something that's already emerged, is a kind of global ethic that really incorporates bits and pieces of, but it does not belong to any historical tribe. That is, I think, really, as I said, the Enlightenment project, and I'm all for it. So.
Okay. I just want to announce that we have a lunch break of a little over an hour, so we're due back here at 2:15, and I'd like to thank the panelists again for a wonderful session. So thank you.